Welcome to the Kolbecast, episode 325. Thank you for joining us. Today we welcome homeschooling mother, historian, editor, and author, Dr. Dixie Dillon Lane to the Kolbecast. Dixie has recently written a book about the history of homeschooling called Skipping School, A History of American Homeschooling and How It Went Mainstream. Through research, Dixie traces the origins of homeschooling through the lens of the homeschool movement in Southern California and its evolution to its current form today. In addition to this history, Dixie also shares her wisdom and experience as a homeschooling mother to talk about the benefits of homeschooling and navigating some of the challenges that it can present. We hope that you enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Kolbe homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn, and podcast fanatic.
And this is Stephen, homeschooling father of 5 and director of development for Kolbe Academy.
Hi, Stephen. How are you?
Doing well. It's a Friday afternoon when we're recording, which is not quite common for us. So this is exciting. A good way to kind of wrap up the week, I think.
Indeed, I agree. I've been looking forward to this recording for a while. Our guest today is historian Dixie Dillon Lane. She's here to discuss her new book, Skipping School, A History of American Homeschooling and How It Went Mainstream. Hi, Dixie. Welcome to the Kolbecast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
It's very lovely to meet you. I remember seeing your name and reading your writing in Hearth and Field a while back. So since then, I would notice you in other spaces too, and then I've been following the progression to your book's publication. So I'm very thankful that you came to visit with us today and looking forward to hearing about it. I would love to get to know you a bit. Would you tell us a bit about yourself and your background and all that sort of stuff?
Sure. Well, I'm so happy to talk with you too, and I'm really excited to hear you mention Hearth and Field. I'm an editor there, and that's sort of my primary job outside of homemaking and homeschooling. So I have 4 kids, 3 of whom are currently homeschooled. My eldest goes to a small Catholic school, but she was homeschooled for 8 or 9 years. And so the bulk of my day looks very much like it probably looks for most of your listeners. Putting out fires, trying to attend to everyone's needs, observe everyone's hearts, and make sure we all have as positive an experience as we can as we learn together.
I love how you phrase that, especially the tending to everyone's hearts. Tell me a bit more about your history background. How did that come to be, and what's been your path there?
Sure. So I'm a trained historian. I have a PhD in history from Notre Dame, and this book is very tied up with my life as a historian as well as a mother. So the book, of course, is a history of homeschooling, and I started working on it when I started working on my PhD dissertation at Notre Dame. And at that point, I wasn't married and I didn't have children. And gradually over the years, got married, started having kids, and my husband and I decided to homeschool. And so my professional life as a historian has been this weaving and wending in and out of my personal life as a mother, and, trying to make decisions for the good of my family with my husband. And so I decided to work on the history of homeschooling, in part because although I wasn't homeschooled myself, I've just always been so interested by questions of education. And I wanted to study families and how families made decisions about these things that are so important, not just for the family, but for the whole public, how we educate our children and that our children are raised with strong academics and a safe environment and a lot of love and formation and virtue and in their culture. So I started it from that interest, and then I ended up kind of diving into the actual practice too of homeschooling, which was pretty crazy. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, like, of all the topics to study, how you ended up like settling on the homeschooling topics. So I'm glad to hear the backstory there. Yeah. And so the timing for the book's publication, you've been working on this for a while, and now it is in book form for all of us to get to benefit from all of the work you put into it. Can you take us through a bit of that process, some memorable moments along the way, what this production process has been like?
Sure. And I don't know if you've observed this, Bonnie and Stephen, but, there's sort of this really wonderful energy that seems to be happening um, among women who are really devoted to their home and family and are creative people and are, not, are trying to spend time with their children and attend to their children, but also may have to do some professional work or want to do some professional work. And in this new age of the 2020s, there are all these amazing ways to do that. And so when I started working on this research project, like I said, I wasn't married. And then when I had my children, just because of the circumstances of our family, I ended up becoming a full-time homemaker and then ending up deciding to homeschool. And so all of that was sort of put on pause. And I did do a little bit of teaching, and I did finish my dissertation. I can't even remember how I managed to finish my dissertation. That
Yeah.
was, I don't understand that, but I'm glad it got done. I'm glad I got the PhD. But then, like you sort of follow the path God unfurls before you. So I was doing that. I was doing that. And at some point, I was homeschooling my 4 kids. And I started to have the urge to write, and my youngest was just getting out of diapers, and I started to have a little bit of time. And I discovered that when I started writing, and I mean writing essays, like freelance writing, that I would leave everything else behind. So even though I was still home, it was like a mental refresh for me. And I just started pursuing that a little bit while still spending my time grounded in the home with my children. And I was very fortunate that I started getting responses from magazines. And that was not long after the pandemic. And as I think most of us know, during the pandemic, homeschooling experienced a really unexpected boom. It became something that lots of different kinds of people were doing all of a sudden. The numbers rose very high. People were very curious about it. Some people were very critical about it. And so now that I was established a little bit as a writer, I started thinking, well, my research project had ended like the end of what I was researching in 2010. And I thought, well, there's been 10 and then 15 years of development in homeschooling, and people are really curious about it. And I also noticed that, I don't know if you remember this, but during the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, there were a lot of people who were suddenly really sympathetic toward homeschooling, and people were saying, wow, this is really hard work. Like, how can we do this? Help us, give us. I don't know if Colby experienced increased enrollment, but I know a lot of places all of a sudden did. North Carolina's website for registering homeschooling crashed that fall because of the number of people registering. But
Yeah.
at the same time, I noticed the media becoming very harshly critical of homeschooling. And I started to wonder a little bit more about what the current data was, because we all have feelings and experiences about homeschooling, but we need to know what it's like in the national character. What are the patterns across it? Because when you have the media talking about homeschooling, sometimes they're just like talking off the cuff. Are these stereotypes correct? And at the same time, as a homeschooling mom, of course, I want to think that negative stereotypes are not correct, but that's not good enough. We need to look and try to find out. So I decided to start working on that project again and update it and make it a book that went all the way up to 2024. So that is the long story of how that happened. It was really in response to just what you see out there. I want us to have some real information about homeschooling rather than just impressions.
I'm really impressed with the depth and breadth of your sources. My sister is a Colby alumna. Actually, she read the book as well, and that was the first thing she mentioned. You describe in the book how you approach that, the instruments you've used to visit with people and collect your information. Would you give us just a little overview of that, what folks have to look forward to when they go and read the book themselves and see the work that has gone into this?
Sure, and thank you for noting that. I think one of the reasons that it's so hard to say to say things about homeschooling in a general way, like we can all talk about our own experiences, but it's really hard to be accurate generally because homeschoolers are really hard to study because they are all over the place. They're very different. They come from all different communities, and at the same time, the legality of homeschooling in all 50 states was only established about 15 years ago. So if you're talking about homeschooling in the 1970s or 80s or even 90s, it was legal, but people weren't sure it was legal. um, And so, as I say in the book, homeschoolers did not want to be studied. They did not want to be counted. So there's not data about homeschoolers. There aren't a lot of research projects about homeschoolers. That really starts about 2000. There was some research done by a couple of researchers in particular that was really excellent in the 1990s, but it was very small sample because that was all that could be done. So when I went to look at trying to talk about the history of homeschooling, I had to ask myself, well, how am I going to get sources about a population that sociologists call it a hidden population? They do not want to be found. They aren't writing letters to the editor. Newspapers aren't going to help me. So what I tried to do was triangulate between a lot of different kinds of sources. So on the one hand, I did look at traditional archival historical sources like newspapers and magazines and radio shows and letters and things like that. And I was able to find out about some big court case controversies through that. And then I was able to study those cases and how people reacted to them. And then I was also able to study some public homeschooling leaders who were, a public face of homeschooling at the time. And then I decided that it was important for me to speak to homeschoolers themselves. And I was able to interview, I think it was around 45 homeschoolers, whether in person or by phone or writing, sort of focused in California, but really all over the country, because in the book, I don't want to lose sight of the people who are homeschooling any more than I want to lose sight of the national patterns. So I thought it was really important to hear what homeschoolers had to say about what they did and why they did what they did and what their experiences were. Sometimes researchers can be dismissive of their subjects or, make assumptions about their subjects. And one of my goals was to be, as historians are supposed to be, both critical and generous of this topic. And I wanted homeschoolers to recognize something in the book, even if they didn't recognize the whole narrative or they didn't agree with everything I said. I didn't want them to say, that is totally wrong. It was not like that at all. Yeah.
I'd just taken a course on research in the counseling and psychology profession. So when I picked up your book, it was like, qualitative research. I love this. And it's like, no, this is not just like somebody kind of throwing out ideas about homeschooling. This is a research project here. This is, you've got all of the footnotes and all of the information, but that was one of the first things that just struck me. It's like, oh, this is real. This isn't just yeah.
Oh yeah.
I was going to say, it's funny because when you're doing interviews, so as a historian, I love sources, right? I love historical sources. They're so fascinating to me. But we always have to remember that the source itself has a story. And for any source that is an interview, it actually has two authors, the interviewer and the interviewee, if it's an oral history interview. Or any kind of interview, I guess. And I was the interviewer. So I was in this strange position of helping to create some of the sources that I was drawing from. And so I really had to investigate best practices about that. I went to a training institute to learn, how to ask open-ended questions. And I had to make decisions. I remember the first interview that I went and I did in person, just agonizing about what to wear, because I did not want to communicate that I belonged to a particular group through my clothing, but I also didn't want to offend. And I knew some of the people that I would be interviewing would be very conservative in their dress. So I was like, I had all these clothes laid out and I was trying to figure out what to wear, and how to respond when they would ask me things about myself. So it was very humbling and very interesting and just really a privilege that these people would share their stories with me.
Sorry,
I
Stephen.
really appreciated as well the large scope that you took. I mean, because I have, I myself wasn't homeschooled, but my wife was. Her family was homeschooling in the 80s and 90s. And so I've kind of been aware of the Catholic homeschooling movement, from that time on. I've been working in homeschooling now for about 20 years, but it was really interesting to see, though, the more universal aspect of that, and not just like, oh, here's Seton and there's Mother Divine Grace and here's
Yeah.
Colby Academy. And that was also very interesting to see the different
Yeah.
people working side by side or together in some instances to make
Yeah.
things work.
I also wanted to compliment you on the eye-catching cover and title of the book. Just as you're talking about how you are presenting yourself for the interview, same thing with the book itself, to get folks to give it a chance to pick it up and read it. Is there a story you want to tell behind how that came to be?
Sure, I agree. I think the design of the book was all the publisher. I mean, like they just did such a beautiful job, and it has this, I don't know, it has this gorgeous red spine. And I didn't know about that. I'd only seen the cover, and when my author copies arrived, I was like, "Look at this spine! It's so pretty." I had come up with the title a long time ago. Just it was alliterative, and I think skipping school. It's sort of a statement, and it's also sort of a question. Is this really what homeschoolers are doing, or what does this mean? And then the publisher came up with this just awesome subtitle that I thought really captured it: a history of American homeschooling and how it went mainstream, because that's really the thrust of it. Is it's not just a history, it's an explanation of what homeschooling is today as well. Um, but yeah, the cover has this bus that's sort of going off the cover. So it's like it's the school bus is passing you by, but then what is there? What is there with you? When the book was released, my kids and I actually made a cake shaped like a school bus, and we put little Oreos on the on the wheels, and I was like, it's a great homeschool project.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's sort of the story of the design, and I actually really just was really blessed in the publisher, Erdman's, which is a small Christian press that does both trade and academic publishing. Homeschooling overall is so diverse, and so often you will find that homeschoolers are sort of linking up or supporting communally with people who otherwise would be kind of outside of their circle, because this is something that's so meaningful to just the whole population and even beyond Christians. And so when we look at our own local communities of homeschooling, I think this is one of the places where we get our impressions or our assumptions about homeschooling, because it's such a local thing, that we can think that it's only what it is here in our little circle, but there are circles like this all over the country, and they're all different. So we have to find a way to capture the experience, that personal, family, local experience, and also see patterns that are national to understand what the thing is. Because it's a local response, but it's also a response to national patterns and national movements in education and in other things in society. And I think it's also true that, people homeschool for multiple reasons. And
Mhm.
it's really interesting because most of the surveys that ask people why they homeschool, they do allow people to choose multiple reasons, which is nice. So then you get sort of a ranking of what is not just what is the most important reason, but also like what is most often chosen as first, what is most often chosen as second. And one of the really interesting changes is that religious motivation has moved down in those rankings. Now, it's kind of hard to say because the language that is used to ask that question usually asks about whether parents are homeschooling in order to provide religious instruction, which is not exactly the same thing as asking whether they have religious reasons.
Yeah.
for homeschooling, but it's sort of
Mhm.
the closest thing we have. And that's separated now. It used to be that that would be combined with moral instruction, but now the question is separated. Is it for religious instruction? Is it for moral instruction? And so it's really interesting because you'll see that there are people who have chosen to homeschool for their children's moral instruction who have not chosen to homeschool for their children's religious instruction. It's like, this is fascinating. So this isn't just something that is a religiously countercultural act, but this is something where a lot of different kinds of parents have moral and academic and safety concerns about public schooling. It's not just conservative Christians who have these concerns about public schools. This is a much more shared kind of thing. So that's just really fascinating to me how those motivations change and how they layer up, and a lot of the time there are reasons in there that we can share with people who may be different from us in other ways, in the same way that we find we share things with other parents just by nature of being parents, even if we have different belief systems,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's cool. It's like a little realignment that goes beyond institutional lines and political lines.
It's even interesting there. I guess it seems like growing up, religion and spirituality, and those things were still as well, just meshed together. But certainly I see now that many people say that they're spiritual but not religious or whatever. So again, I'm tied up with the Catholic world still. So it's all kind of enmeshed generally with what I'm doing. But I could see just a lot of people who are specifically in my realm, even if it's not morals, that there's something more they're looking for that isn't being met in the public sector, I guess.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, people who are particularly religious, most of the most Christian faiths and Judaism and a lot of faiths have private schooling available. Now, Catholics probably have the biggest system, the Catholic diocesan school or parochial schools, and the longest lived, but it's true of other faiths as well. And it's interesting that not going to public school is not just a matter now of either being terrifically wealthy, so you're going to Andover, or or Choate or whatever, or a matter of or some day school, or a matter of like a religious objection. So some people who, for example, you know, so it's almost like folks who have these concerns with the public school and are not religious, they don't have a religious school system to turn to.
Right.
And homeschooling is becoming more and more accessible and attractive. And Catholic homeschooling is so interesting too, because of course we do have diocesan schools and we also have private Catholic schools. And so trying to tease out, well, why do people homeschool instead of using these diocesan schools or these private Catholic schools? That was really interesting and spoke a lot to changes in the past 50 years too.
I found that interesting as well. And just kind of thinking that folks I know and our own family's experience and things.
And of course, it's so important too to remember, and this came through in the research too, that people don't only homeschool because they're dissatisfied with public schools. People also homeschool for positive reasons, for active reasons,
Sure.
Things they want for their children that are real goods, things they love being with their children, getting to observe their children, know their children many hours of the day, not having to be on the rat race of school, getting everybody up and waking the baby up from their nap, and the freedom to explore different curricula and different ideas and go on field trips. There's all this just richness to homeschooling that also draws people in.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting to me because my roots came from Mother Divine Grace. I spent a lot of years with Mother Divine Grace, and they started out with a secular school as part of the Catholic branch of a secular school that primarily oriented themselves toward athletes and Hollywood actors because they needed flexible schedules to do these things. So it was a very different sort of environment. But then I think it was actually one of the families that you mentioned in your book, the Haggards, Mary Mark. I think she connected Laura Berquist with this Laurel Springs school, and then all of a sudden here starts in 1995. There starts another one of these big growing curriculum school providers that we see. So, but yeah, certainly not born initially out of that Catholic homeschool movement, but something that was added on.
Yeah, and if you think about it, homeschooling, again, it's so local. It's like ultra local, right? It's the family. So there's a million different ways to do it, but you also just find, when people try to organize, if they're organizing a co-op or they're organizing a curriculum provider or, a micro school even, they're going to do that outside of what they think of as school systems or traditional school systems. It's all going to be sort of tailored and inventive. So it's all going to be a little bit different. And it's really kind of inspiring to see how there's support, of that difference among homeschoolers in a lot of ways. Like not always, but it's just a great example of like, Catholics and non-Catholics, or, you can have pedagogical differences or even geographic differences, and see how you can sort of just give a hand to each other, just give a hand up, because, we all think this is a good thing, to be trying to get a good education for our children.
You lay out quite beautifully the development of homeschooling from around the time shortly after the Second World War up to present day. Are there highlights of that you are able to give as a sort of a glimpse of the development of homeschooling as an invitation to learn more about it in your pages?
Sure. I think, the little golden books.
Yes.
They're so sweet. They're so lovely. And I love to read those to my children when they're young. And there are a couple of ones that my children love when the kids go to school. And I think that sometimes in our minds in America, we think of this kind of like idealized 1950s school as, first of all, what always was, and second of all, what always should be. And I'm not here to bust, stories about the good things in history, because there were good things, of course. But schooling in America has always been changing. Education has always been changing. And the 1950s, which is that time we sort of harken back to, maybe because grandparents were in school in the 50s and 60s, that was a time when education was synonymous with school, or at least academic education in America. And that was almost the first time that was the case. So all throughout history, there have been a lot of different ways to get an education in America, and schooling has always been prized. It's always been something that people have supported, but it's never been the only way until the 20th century. So we were in a different paradigm in the middle of the 20th century. And it's really interesting that that's when home education started to re-emerge after a few decades of nobody doing this, and it emerged as something really countercultural. And part of that was because schools were changing. And I talk in my book about how the Cold War was a big driver in this, because schools had come to the greater attention of the federal government during the early space race, because Eisenhower realized that if we needed researchers to keep up with the space race, we needed to have children who were being educated to become researchers, and we needed to put money into that kind of education. So this is when federal money and federal attention started really being turned toward education, which had always been something that was determined not just on the state, but really on the town level, in American history, and at the family level. So anyway, there are two threads then in American history, right? There's the thread of school, and school becoming more consolidated, more controlled by experts, more top-down curricula across the country, like the Common Core that we saw established in our century, becoming nationalized, standards becoming nationalized, more testing. That's one thread, sort of the federalization and professionalization of schooling. The other thread is a belief that education is something that should be determined by families, by parents, and controlled by the local community that can react to and respond to the needs of its children in accordance with its own beliefs. And so I think what happened with the reemergence of homeschooling was that some families just started to act on that second belief, and take their children out of school. And then, to make a long story short, over the coming decades, that was adjudicated in courts. And eventually, homeschoolers were able to start organizing themselves, which gave them some protection, so that they could grow. And, eventually this became something that was very public. It was no longer a hidden population. It was no longer hidden. And so we saw, when the schools locked down in 2020, homeschooling was something that was not only available for parents to turn to, but it turned out it was something they were willing to turn to. And I argue in my book that suggests that thread of parental influence and localism in education, that's still a strong belief in America. And I think that complicates a little bit the history and the idea we have of school, that school is the only everlasting way, and public school in particular.
We talk about subsidiarity a lot here at Kolbe Academy. And so as you're talking about that development, you can certainly see where, that closeness where decisions are being made closest to the people being affected is slipping away. And at some point you just want to, it's like, no, I can't, it's gone too far now for what I'm comfortable with. But I can also see just kind of, I grew up in rural Wisconsin, and I always say we're like a generation behind. So in the, back in the 80s, I was part of the last wooden frame schoolhouse in the state of Wisconsin in first through fourth grade. But even at that point, there were 2 teachers for all 4 grades, 2 classrooms. There were 7 kids in my grade in the whole school. So, and there were these little schools that could be easily bused to in the areas. But by the time I was in high school, that was no longer the case any longer. It was all one big school. K through 12 was what everybody did at that point. So even you can just kind of see that, like, we're standardizing things. We're making things uniform, and each, as we talk about in homeschooling, each child is different. Each demand of a family and their children are unique, and the more you make it the same, the harder it is for each individual to really be cared for, it seems like.
I agree, and I think subsidiarity is an important principle in education, and I wish it was something. It's actually a word I only use a couple of times in my book. And I used it a lot, and then I took it out because I realized that it's not a term that a lot of non-Catholics are familiar with, but it's such a wonderful principle. But in education, as in lots of social goods, like education is a private good, but it's also a public good. So the public does have responsibilities and interest in the education of children, but it's sort of like, where is that balance going to be? And we can all think of examples of times when justice truly has required some kind of outside intervention in a local decision, for example. And that's true in education. So it's not as if having local communities or even parents in control of education is going to guarantee that it's all right. But I think there's a real tendency to take the exception and say that we have to have large scale, top down state, federal control of education writ large in order to protect children from, small percentages of problems. So instead of trying to find some sort of balance or compromise, there's this like, no, sometimes kids are educationally neglected, and therefore the government must control all schools always. And we're not going to bother to talk about whether schools are actually educating children either. So it is tough because these things are real. There needs to be a balance, but it's like it's shifted so wildly in one direction, and it's not working in terms of student performance. The public schools are not working. They're not working for literacy. They're not working for numeracy. They're not working for civics. They're not working. And yet that is still sort of what the media would like us and politics would like us to say is the like foundational good American education, and that homeschooling kids are at risk if they're not in that situation. And it's just, if you're looking at research data, that's just not true. It may be that certain children need intervention in one direction or another, but it's just not true that children who aren't in public schools are somehow missing out on this fabulous, education that they would have otherwise. So it's hard. It's a hard situation.
Yeah, I like how you laid that out there. And that is one of the things the subsidiarity question, and I can see why you might pull that out, because even within Kolbe, it's like, this is one of our founding principles, but we spent like a year just delving into, well, what do the church encyclicals say? Where do these, and it's not just parents can do whatever they want is not the answer to what subsidiarity is. So and I love the example of the Eisenhower saying, what's important for our country is that this happens. And so maybe we don't end up trying to achieve that in the best way, or maybe negative consequences come out of that. But I think that's legitimately an interest of the country to have. Yeah.
Yeah. And with subsidiarity, you could also say, because schools vary so much. So even though we are moving so much toward centralization or standardization in schools, schools still vary so much, even within a single district, often because they're tied to property taxes, or a tiny town has its own district so that it doesn't have to have anyone who's not upper middle class in its district. There are plenty of these kinds of towns. And the next town over, everyone is below the poverty level. And so there's no, mixing there. But, some schools, some schools are better than others. And so in that sense too, if you have access to a public school that's going to suit your child well, or is going to support your family, is going to be responsive to your family's needs, great. And you should be able to take advantage of that. But the kid in the next town over, his terrible public school should not be his only option. That is absolutely unjust. We talk about school choice, and if the public schools on average are not meeting proficiency goals, then there's no real choice.
Right.
Because people can't afford to send their kid to Andover. Like we said, I mean, some people can, but there's no choice if you don't have access as a normal person. So homeschooling can step in there and help families get an education for their children when they can't access it through schools. Yeah. And also for these positive reasons too, that it can be so wonderful for children and their parents.
I knew very interesting, and maybe you've seen some of this as well, but as we've kind of moved, post pandemic, I guess, not only for people being more accepting of public schooling, or homeschooling, I'm sorry, but it's interesting to me that the more families that I talk to either have two parents that work, or maybe they have one parent, but I'm seeing a lot more fathers who are the primary teachers of their homeschooling families. But again, I guess it's possibly the expansion of remote work or different options for people given the internet and things. But back in the day, it seemed like that it really wasn't an option. It was like one person can work in the family, the other has to be the full-time homeschooler. I wonder if that's part of your thoughts on this. Is that part of the change of the acceptance or even availability, I guess, maybe of homeschooling today?
Yeah, I think it's funny there. I think there are two stereotypes of homeschoolers economically, and one is that they're impoverished and backward. And the other is that they're really wealthy. Like you have to have a lot of privilege to homeschool. And looking at the census data on homeschoolers economically, It's the same as everyone else. Every economic class. I mean, it's nearly the same demographically in terms of income, also in terms of metrics like experiencing hunger. It's also nearly the same in terms of whether you're urban, suburban, rural, small town. So I think you're right, Stephen. It really requires the focus of one parent in a primary way. And very often that has been the mother, and there are lots of different reasons for that. But we also know my friend Ivana Greco has done research recently on homemakers through Capita, the think tank. And she found that about 10% of her sample in her study that she did with her colleague, Elliot Haspel, were stay-at-home fathers. So say that metric is relatively accurate across the nation. I don't know if it is. But even the parents who were primarily the at-home parent or the primary caregiver are not just mothers anymore. Yep. And I think you're right, too, that during the pandemic, one of the things that people expressed, and I remember hearing it, people like to be with their children. People who go out, when you have a two-income family, of course, every family is different, and there's lots of different reasons to have a two-income family. But it's not usually like, I can't stand my kids. This is how this job works. I need this job for whatever reason it is, whether it's personal growth or goals or it's income or it's some combination. People like to be able to spend more time with their children. And Ivana's research has also shown that people prefer to have, in general, not everyone, childcare that is outside of daycare, so that is with a friend or a family member, or to have flex time. So this is what people actually want, is to be with their children. And homeschooling has benefited from the more flexible work, especially if you're doing some sort of office job. I mean, this certainly isn't the case for all kinds of jobs, but I have another friend she and her husband are both academics, and they homeschool their children. And for a long time, she was the primary homeschooling mother. I mean, she still is the primary homeschooling parent, but they also sort of find ways to switch off, and he does math, and it can be shared in a way that it couldn't be shared for a long time in the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of our century. So parents like to be with their children. I don't know why that's so mind-blowing, but we like our children. We delight in them. We want help. Of course we want help, but gosh, it's just a privilege to teach your child to read. Oh my goodness. When it clicks, it's just like nothing else. Or, reading a poem aloud to your child and you see them shiver. That's the privilege. That's the privilege, is being with your children.
Very true.
We're having Dr. Kolbecast on the
wonderful
podcast soon, but he just has a book out or coming out about the intentional household. As you're saying that, it's like, I think this is something people are realizing, is that those relationships between members of the family are slipping away because of the busyness. And when you've got two people working outside the home, all the kids are outside of the home, it's just really hard to make the time. And I could see from what you just said that people are recognizing this, that especially after the pandemic, that I love my kids. They're joyful, and it's a joy to be around them. It's wonderful to experience that. Let's intentionally make time to make sure we don't lose that again, or that we make more time, that we can grow this. I know it's one of the biggest things that I talk about. With one of the biggest gifts for me, it's that my wife kind of gave to me, because she was very interested in being a homeschooling mom and taking that on. And so with my 5 kids, I've had the pleasure of just being able to get to know them as people and watch them develop and have those long conversations at the dinner table after dinner. And it's like, I wouldn't give that up for anything, but I might have lost it had I not had an intentionality about, this is what we've decided to do as a family. So
yes, and of course, parents who, when both parents work, they still can have strong relationships with their children and enjoy them and such. But it's almost like homeschooling's a hack for getting more of it, And the working world didn't permit it in the same way before the pandemic. So it's so much more possible to work from home or whatever. And even if your family is still working on a breadwinner model, and say the dad is working, say he's working from home, he can't be constantly interrupted by kids, but at the same time he can come out at lunch and do so, so it's more flexible. And I would add to that, it still is mothers, and primarily I think homemaking mothers, who are doing the bulk of the homeschooling. And that's the case in my family. Um, and it can be hard. So we're talking about all of these benefits of, like, oh, the family can move in and out and the parents can share and stuff. But it's also true that the bulk of it does usually fall to one parent, and that it can be isolating for that parent. And so one of the just best things about having a homeschooling community is not just the socialization for the children, but for the parent, because
Support.
Yeah.
because it's a big job for the mom if she's doing it, and she needs so much support,
Yes.
so much support, and opportunities to take care of her well-being in addition to that, because she's doing something really important.
When we focus on homeschooling moms, I think we'll often talk about that they're basically doing 2 to 3 full-time jobs, unless the family reconfigures or gets the support, because you've got, I mean, in traditional roles, at least like you're saying, a homemaker taking care of the home, managing the home, and being a full-time teacher to 4 to 5, however many kids. And sometimes there's extra things that are fulfilling that also take up time. So
Mhm.
it's no longer, the old stereotype of the, ward cleaver coming home and grabbing the paper and, a pipe after. That just can't work with a homeschooling family. It has to change.
All hands on deck, right?
All hands on
All
deck.
hands
Yes.
on deck.
That's
Yes.
right. Yep.
Yeah, and I mean, it is cool, like with something like Colby as a curriculum provider that offers, and many of them do offer, so many different options. So in terms of support, like I like to put together most of what we do myself for my family. I don't really follow a curriculum, but I have used Colby's lesson plans and book lists. So you can do that, or you can have them fully enrolled, or like there's all these different ways. And so if there's a particular subject you're struggling in, like there are opportunities for support. You don't have to do it all on your own.
I really like the way that things have kind of changed to really be accepting of all of those different methods. I think when I first started out in the homeschooling community, it was like homeschooling is the only way. That's it. But now it's much more obvious to me that that idea of subsidiarity. You're picking what's best and works for your family. It may be the public school is the best thing for your child. It may be a private school. It may be homeschooling, but homeschooling, as you talk about in the book too, done in all these different ways so you get to decide as a parent. But fortunately now there's a lot of resources out there. So there's more options to
Right.
pick.
Yeah. Like the term homeschool it doesn't necessarily fully describe what's happening. It was just a contrast to the normative school.
Yes, because how often are homeschoolers home?
Right, yeah.
I mean,
Yep.
you are, but there's so much going out of the house. There's so much going
Yeah.
out of the
Yep.
house. There's been this funny little argument going on Twitter, where one of those charts of how often families are sick according to how many children they have was going around. I don't know if you've seen those, but it's like, if you have 2 children, you'll be sick 50% of the year, and like, whatever. And some people were saying, well, this is another reason to homeschool. And it was like, well, only if you never leave the house.
Right, yeah.
When you go to the library with your kids, they're going to pick something up.
Yes.
So we're out and about too.
Well, I like how your book envisions where homeschooling is headed and kind of where the various, as Stephen just mentioned, sort of the various scenarios that have developed and where things are now. I will leave that as an invitation to folks to check out in the book. I would love to hear your thoughts as a homeschooling mom yourself, the importance you place on encouraging independence in kids.
Sure, that's something that I write about fairly often as a freelancer too. Childhood independence, not as opposed to dependence. We want our families to be interdependent. We want to be looking at how to help one another and supporting one another and thinking of others. But one thing that is just a wonderful opportunity in homeschooling is to help your children learn how to handle themselves, how to interact with others, how to make good decisions, and how to take care of themselves. So in my college teaching over the years, you have kids coming in with a really wildly different set of skills in that area. Some kids have no idea, not just homeschoolers, but students. Some kids have no idea how to talk to a professor, like, how to like come up and say, "Excuse me, Dr. So and so, I had a question about my paper." Like they just can't do it, or don't know how to make a doctor's appointment or things like that. And one of the things that is true about our time is that families really need to address those things deliberately. And a wonderful way to do that is through establishing age appropriate independence. And that means letting your kids try things sort of like in a Montessori way, letting your young children learn how to fry an egg or letting them make a mess while they're cleaning, because they're going to gradually get better and better, rather than saying no, only to your level of tolerance, of course.
Yes.
But also, encouraging them to be in situations that are not unsafe for them, that are still safe for them, but that require them to make decisions and make good judgment themselves. And there's been a lot of research that has shown that independent projects, whether it's something like cooking a meal by yourself or walking down to the grocery store by yourself at an appropriate age, is hugely effective against childhood anxiety. And we know that childhood anxiety and depression has really risen. And when children find out that they actually can do things, that they can do things themselves, that they can take care of themselves, and that they can find help when they need it, that's extremely freeing. So my family has really prioritized that with our children. And it's just been a very gradual process where, first you walk with the children to the grocery store and you do that 15 times,
Yep.
But, with the 3-year-old, when she wants a candy bar, you have her go up to the cashier and you help her make the transaction herself. And then by the time she's 5, she can do it fully by herself. And then by the time she's 8, you can pull into the Dunkin' Donut parking lot and hand her a $10 bill and say, "Go order 4 donuts." And she can do it. And I'll tell you, they come back to the car just grinning, just so happy. So I don't want to talk too long on this, but I would just say that if parents are interested in this kind of thing and they don't know how to do it, just remember that there's preparation involved. So like in our town, we've found particular places that are welcoming to our children that way, where we've gotten to know the owners. And, you can always just expand your community a little bit. Send your kids out in groups and give them the opportunity to do little things and then grow bit by bit. And then from a homeschooling perspective, you have children who have a belief about themselves. They have a belief that if they're curious about something, they can figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
As opposed to a child who has a belief that if he's curious about something, he has to get his mom to tell him what to do. And that's just it's a really great preparation for a thriving adult life, I think.
Yep. Underlining that agency, like you're not helpless.
Yeah, but it's like a feeling. I don't know if you know what I mean, but it's like a feeling that, especially, if I'm in trouble, I know how to get help.
Right.
People
will help
or
me. Yes.
That kind of thing, helping children to understand, what do you do? Because they will in their lives encounter situations when you're not there. So
Yep.
how you help them prepare for that?
They're built for that. Yep. That's right. Yep. I agree.
When you're telling that story about the grin on your children, it reminds me of back, I don't know if I was 10 or whatever, growing up in a small town. My grandfather sent me to the store, which was, a quarter of a mile away in town, but with a $20 bill to buy him a carton of cigarettes. And so here I am, this little boy walking up, and they knew who my grandfather was, of course. So there was no problem, but I still have this memory of doing I bought my grandfather cigarettes when I was 10
Took
years
care of
old.
that.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also, I mean, there are a lot of factors that make it harder in some ways. Like there's fear. Obviously, people have fear, but also the cars are crazy. There aren't sidewalks and stuff, and just kind of like that trying to figure out how to spend more time with your children hack we were talking about. You got to look for hacks. So we live, our house is in a neighborhood that's off of an extremely busy road. We're not on that road, but to get to town, you have to walk on this road. There's no sidewalk, there's no shoulder, and people are going 55. So obviously we're not walking on that road, you know,
Yeah.
but we actually found a shortcut. And, my children and I went up and knocked on doors and said, could we have permission to walk through your yard? Could we have permission to cross your creek? And people are delighted to give permission to that, because here's another secret. Most people want to see kids doing things. They don't want kids inside on their tablets all day. And so if your kid is walking around the neighborhood offering to mow lawns, he will get customers.
Right.
Because it's not just that people want their lawn mowed, they want children mowing lawns.
Sure. Yeah.
And when you're able to do that, you've also created a constellation of neighbors around your neighborhood who are people that will look out for your children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And the kids grow up to do that themselves for others. Yes.
Very
Yep.
good point.
Yep.
Yeah. They will always stop at a child's lemonade stand when they are grown up.
Aw, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, very good. Well, it's so fun chatting with you, Dixie. We could go on and on. I know there are time bounds, alas. So, any final thoughts or takeaways at this point? Anything you want to point to that you're looking forward to?
Oh, well, I just think that homeschooling is such an amazing and interesting and inspiring and challenging and complex project, and I hope that people will find in the book some understanding of where they fit into the constellation of other people who are doing this, and just of the country generally, and maybe to understand a little bit about homeschooling as a movement, but also just get some clarity about who we are and what's going on in other schools too. And I hope it will be informative and encouraging for people to understand better what's really true about homeschooling from a research perspective, and hopefully that can help help us make decisions not just for our own kids, but to really try to support the education of all of our children, as all kids do have a right to a safe and healthy education.
Alrighty, so our show notes will have a link to your book, Skipping School. You're also quite present online, as how I discovered you through Hearth and Field. Tell us about your various places where folks can connect with you.
Sure. Well, I have two Substacks. One is called The Hollow, and that's sort of maybe an email list of my work. So if you want to follow my research and my writing, I also freelance for a number of online magazines about different things. And then the other Substack is called The Bad Moms Homeschool. I run that with a couple of my friends, and that I hope you can come to for pragmatic advice that will not make you anxious or ashamed when you're having homeschooling problems. And then Hearth and Field is a really unique journal that I hope people will check out. I'm an editor there. It's Catholic in its orientation, broadly Christian in its orientation. And it's not just about hearths and fields, but about sort of how we can try to be grounded in real life and in connection with each other and the places we live and the things we do with our minds and our hands. And we try to make it a very beautiful publication. So I hope people will check that out. It's both online and it's also a print quarterly. So you can subscribe to get a beautiful, thick, wonderful magazine in your mail 4 times a year too.
Fun mail. Yes. Very good. What a pleasure it's been visiting with you, Dixie. I hope we get another opportunity to do so soon. And congratulations on the publication of your book. And thank you for all the work you put into that and shared with us, and for spending this time with us today.
Well, thank you for speaking with me, and thank you very much for all the work you do to support homeschooling families.
Subscribe to the Kolbecast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@kolbe.org.
Mary, our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, St. Ignatius of Loyola, holy saints and angels, pray for us. Ad maiorem Dei gloriam.